They came through some of the hardest times that Japanese society had to go through. But I didn't know the story before. My dad would, like to tell us about like, oh, I grew up in the poverty. You guys are all lucky because we have more money than I had ever imagined that we would have and all that stuff. But the story before of this, the war times, he never really talked about because he really didn't remember much of it. So, it's an interesting story that I hope to get more details out of a few surviving members of my family to compile into something one of these days, hopefully before too long.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Season 1, Episode 13 of MigrAsians. I'm Nisha Modi, your host. In this episode, my guest is another part of the creative talent team for MigrAsians. Today, you'll hear my conversation with Shin Kawasaki, who wrote what I call the MigrAsian song, which is actually called Find Another Way. Shin was recommended to me by Quincy Surasmith, my podcast editor, who, by the way, also hosts a fantastic podcast called Asian Americana, so check it out. And I was really intrigued by Shin's sounds. He calls himself a Soundchaser, and after listening to his music, it's very obvious why. But before we get into this episode, I want to thank all of you for your support through rating and reviewing MigrAsians on Apple Podcasts, through telling your friends and family about it, and for your financial support as well. Shin is one of the people I invested in for this podcast because I thought it was essential to center Asian voices, whether they were behind the scenes or not. And now, Shin is both. This podcast takes a lot of time and labor, especially during this time of uncertainty. I can't tell you how much your support contributes to the success of this podcast. So if you like what you hear, head over to Apple Podcasts and give me a rating and review. And if you're able, please contribute to MigrAsians. You can offer a monthly contribution at www.patreon.com/migrAsians, or you could just do a one-time contribution. At the $5 a month level, I send you MigrAsian stickers. And at the $10 a month level, you get a book handpicked by yours truly after 6 months. So check it out. That's www.patreon.com/migrasians. All right, let's get this episode started. Welcome, everyone. Today, I'm going to be talking to Shin Kawasaki. He is the musician behind our MigrAsian song, Find Another Way. Shin was born in Japan and moved to Los Angeles in 1999 and considers himself Americanized Japanese. He is a self-described sound chaser and has a new EP release, which came out in February, titled 6 Songs from Insomnia. Find him on all the streaming platforms under Shin Kawasaki, one word. And today we are recording on May 18th, 2020. I've been mentioning this in COVID times just so everyone has a reference point for when this conversation is happening. So thank you so much for being here, Shin. How are you?
I am good. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so speaking of COVID, it's hard to not start conversations this way. How have things been for you as a musician? I believe you had your Tuesday night residency. So yeah, tell me, how's that been for you?
Well, the Tuesday residency at the place called the Escondite, which is right in the middle of Little Tokyo and Skid Row, actually. And we had done 6 shows, I think, before the pandemic declaration, which basically shut down all the restaurants and bars and stuff. So the business, I'm actually not sure. So this is May 18th, and Saturday or Sunday night, actually, there was a big fire right across the street from that building.
Oh my God.
I heard from the owner briefly that the building itself is okay, but I just haven't been in touch with him all that closely because he was actually out of town for a little bit since the business closed down and everything. So there's a lot of uncertainties out there right now.
It's interesting because it's like, while this is happening, other things still happen. You know what I mean? People get sick in other ways and fires happen and all these things happen while the whole pandemic is going on too.
That's definitely what I have been just actually thinking about in the last week or so. For better or worse, it's become the new norm, right? This whole us on the lockdown, wearing masks everywhere. The news was already crazy before this whole thing happened, and then now this. But yeah, all kinds of issues and all kinds of problems in the world are still in existence, and just it's a lot to wrap anybody's head around. I'm definitely not the only one to be in a bit of a state of confusion and shock and all that stuff. Going back to your question, as a musician, I'm just basically in a state of inactivity, except for the things that I can do online, which a lot of people have been doing. There's millions of live streams going up right now. A lot of my colleagues are being very productive, actually, and I'm trying to kind of keep up as much as I could. And I've been posting more videos and quote unquote content on some of our social outlets and everything. But I'm also trying to utilize this time to kind of better myself in a way, trying to remain calm, finding some kind of inner peace through this confusion and chaos in the world. And it's been actually, and I feel kind of bad to say this, but it's been a kind of a blessing in disguise in a way. I'm getting to the things that I just never had time or mental bandwidth to get to. So, in a way, I'm treating it as an opportunity, basically, because you could always just go into the dark place in your emotion and your psyche, right? So,
No, definitely. I mean, I also kind of feel similarly that I've been able to do some things and had time to reflect that has been really beneficial for me. But at the same time, there are awful things about it. And I think those two things can exist together, but it's just kind of a somber time to have it happen at the same time.
yeah. But the thing is, reflecting, I think, is a great word. And I try not to get on social media as much. I just had the Twitter open on my browser at all times, like when this whole thing happened, just so that you could collect information, right? Because you just didn't know what it was. You didn't even know that you could be asymptomatic and still could be contagious. I mean, that was kind of a big thing for me. And it really, especially as a musician, you encounter so many random people in places. I live downtown LA, highly crowded. I mean, like relatively more crowded than the rest of Los Angeles. And I actually have a handful of immunocompromised friends that I deeply care about. So it really triggered my paranoia. So I was keeping myself updated with any kind of news, any kind of information that I could get my hands on. And it really got to me after a while. So I had to kind of give myself a bit of a social media or the any like news kind of limit on myself to kind of go inwards instead of outwards. You kind of have to have a healthy balance between those two, I feel. But I tend to think that it's better to look inward, especially at this time, than out because there's just so much misinformation right now. Not enough people know enough about what's happening. So if that's the case, I'd rather not feed disinformation in my brain than just like something that I could just kind of work on my own. So reflecting is a good word to describe what I've been actually on for the last at least couple of weeks.
It is really scary, the whole you could be asymptomatic and potentially infect someone because that's not the case with a lot of other viral infections. Like, if you have the flu, like the regular flu, you do, and you know that you're contagious, so you try to stay home, and this seems much more highly contagious. So I think it is scary, and I think your fears are warranted. And I was very similar at the beginning of this, like constantly checking the news, doing all that. And I've been able to pull back from it too, because I think the initial shock, is over, but at the same time, it wasn't good for me. I did also have to find that balance. So I completely relate to what you're saying. Yeah, well, I'm glad that you're able to find some space and outlets to share your music and talents online. I know I've tuned in a little bit on your Instagram. I've seen a couple things. And I'm glad, like I have a friend who spins and he'll go live on Facebook. So I'm glad that there's these cool outlets, and I'm curious how it will look after things go back to people being able to go to physical venues and whatnot for music. I'm still curious if there might be more that's available through these live streams than before, just because of what's happened now?
Hmm. It's, I don't know. I think the judge is still out on that one. I think the overall feeling amongst the musicians or the music community is that it is of the uncertainty because music industry was not really doing all that well before this anyway, right? So streaming, yeah, everybody's really excited about all the streaming aspect of things, but that only benefits very much just the top, whatever the percentage of people that can actually drive enough place to generate income. Whereas us on the 97% of creatives needed to get out on the street and just play live shows to generate some sort of income, selling merch and whatnot. I actually don't know if anything is going to be back to what it was before COVID. The live venues are already closing. Troubadour supposedly might not reopen, which is, I don't know if you know, the Troubadour has been on the what is it, Santa Monica Boulevard in West Hollywood for ages. That's where Elton John started, Jackson Brown, like Guns N' Roses actually did their first show before they went on to do the reunion tour in like 2016 or whenever they decided to reunite. It's been a legendary venue in LA for the longest time, and they might not even survive this whole thing. So if they can't survive, there's much smaller venues. I don't know if they're gonna be able to, along with it, all the other small businesses, which I've been really trying as much as I could to support. And if that is taken away from the music community, I really don't know what could come after this whole thing. And live streaming is one of the ways I know. I know a lot of guys that are actually doing it, but in terms of that as the income source, I don't know. I really don't. I'd be surprised if that could comfortably replace the live gigs that we are so used to doing. So it's a scary time, and then that paranoia is warranted. This is the time that you really need to be thinking about. Well, I feel like I need to be thinking about the next step.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Nothing is gonna be what it was before, and it will evolve, and especially, like you said, the creatives that really do need to go out there and play to survive. I mean, maybe it could be live streaming for some type of cost. I mean, who knows? I think it'll evolve. I think that's the biggest thing.
Yep, yep, yep. And then I feel like if there's any upside, the technology might come around to accommodate the demand for a platform like that much faster than maybe it would have been if it weren't for this. People are using like Zoom. Now, it was not really in the corporate world, so I never knew what it was. I mean, I kind of had heard about it, but almost overnight, everybody's on it, and that's become where people gather. It's almost like, who knows, maybe the Zoom would start hosting music festivals.
Yeah, yeah. It's an opportunity for them, right, to expand their offerings, for sure. Well, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your story about what brought you to LA, but before that, can you tell us a little bit about how your father came to Japan?
So my dad is the youngest of four, and he had a small business when I was growing up, and I basically was raised by my grandma, and my grandma would mention this story like here and there, and my dad would really never talk about it. But as I grew older, I came to learn that my dad actually was born in what is now a like right on the border between northern China and North Korea when it was occupied by Japanese army, and then it was called Manchuria. My grandpa, who passed away when my dad was 6 years old, he basically went to Manchuria to work for Manchurian Railroad, which was somewhat of a common career move for a lot of Japanese, especially in the rural areas. It was like almost like a gold rush out here, like go west and make tons of money when you go into this new world. It's the West. It's the kind of a Japanese equivalent of that. Like whoever wanted to better their lives, they would take on, and Japanese army was really encouraging people to move to Manchuria so that they could really established the Japanese dominance over the region by just having more Japanese nationals over there. So my grandpa moved over there. I don't know the exact timeline, which is something that I really need to look into. And they had been there for over a decade, and that's when my dad was born. And just a few years after that, the war ended. Japan surrendered. So what happened, obviously, was well, the Russians actually came and basically tried to take over the region. So all the Japanese natives basically had to evacuate. My grandpa supposedly had a handful of, I mean, there's no other way to say it, like North Korean servants around the house who supposedly was kind enough to help them basically escape. And in North Korea, right? So you basically had to go all the way down through the Korean peninsula and then just take the ferry boat from South Korea back to Japan. But the North Korea part was basically just heavily guarded and taken over by Russian army. So they basically had to be totally incognito to get to the southern part of Korea. And they supposedly took a freight train down to the border. And once they got close enough, they basically had to be on foot right in the middle of the night in the total darkness and basically had to walk over the border in this pretty heavy forest. Just 10 or 20 of the people that was, I don't know if they actually knew each other when they were trying to cross the border by foot, but it was just mostly Japanese natives that were trying to escape from North Korea, did this overnight excursion in the forest, basically trying to stay stealth from Russian army. And back then, I'm pretty sure there's just so many other forces. North Koreans, I'm pretty sure, weren't really fond of Japanese natives anyway. So if they had found that they were trying to escape, they would have captured Japanese just right there and then, because Japanese weren't really doing any that much good in that whole region anyway. Even though none of this actually my dad remembers. My dad was way too young to remember any of these things, supposedly. But I got all these stories from my auntie, who was a little bit older, and little bits here and there from my grandma as well before she passed away. It's one of those things that like he never opened up to me about, but like once I found out, I was like, man, I need to get a little more little more details on that because it really explains his psyche. I knew that they came from poverty when they got to Toyama, where I'm from, which is like right in the middle of Japan mainland. They basically just came to a city that was just burned down to the ground except for like maybe one building, and they were on the welfare. Everybody in the family had to go out and work while my dad was just too young to work. So he just basically stayed home and just kind of did all the house chores. They came through some of the hardest times that Japanese society had to go through. But I didn't know the story before. My dad would, like to tell us about like, oh, I grew up in the poverty. You guys are all lucky because you have more money than I had ever imagined that we would have and all that stuff. But the story before of this, the war times, he never really talked about because he really didn't remember much of it. So it's an interesting story that I hope to get more details out of a few surviving members of my family to compile into something one of these days, hopefully before too long.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating story, and there's so many parts of history that intersect there. So many parts that we make assumptions or a lot of people just don't know about.
Yep. And it's one of those things where I need to really just read up on a lot more. I mean, I know the basic kind of historical background, and especially now that I've been out here in the States for 20 years, I think the tone back home in Japan has shifted a little, and I hear that there's a little bit of revisionist rhetoric happening around that whole area. I don't think the Japanese nationals want to admit to certain things that we had done in the past in that whole region and all that stuff. So I think it's really worth revisiting, especially the people in our generation that actually still have the connection to that generation, right? Because the younger folks might not. the Japanese society is just more and more compartmentalized, and they don't really have the sense of community that I barely had some. And I was lucky enough to actually be raised by my grandma who lived till like almost 90, and I think she was born in like 1900. So she had seen like three different emperors in her life in one of the most turbulent times in Japanese history. Not many people, younger generation, doesn't have the access to that kind of information. And if the education doesn't come around to really tell the stories in details in an unbiased way, then who's going to tell that story and who's going to learn from the mistakes that we've made?
Shin brings up a great point about how bias enters our history books and education systems so frequently. We are rarely taught the true histories because history is political. Publishing is political. Shin's story of how his dad escaped Manchuria is political. Shin talks more about the politics in Toyama, where he grew up, and in Japan generally.
Where I come from, the Toyama is basically kind of like a red state. It's very conservative. Japanese politics is not quite the binary that we're used to here in the States. Like, there's no like a red blue context. It's just more just LDP, one party that's been ruling over the last almost a century, and there's been a couple of exceptions here and there, but it's just mostly just a one party system. If you actually look at it from the outside perspective, you could see that as like almost, I mean, it's not really like a totalitarian or anything like that, but you kind of have to wonder, like, what is the democracy that they claim to have? You just don't really know well, if they don't really have any other option or not enough politicians that have the diverse perspectives and policies and all that stuff. And what is the democracy? That's one of those things that I think about a lot since I've moved here in the States. But it's just one of those things where I don't know how much you know about the Japanese culture and stuff, but like Japanese tend to suppress, or at least they used to tend to suppress individualism heavily. It was considered the virtue to be in line with everybody else in the community, and that actually expanded to the entire nation. Like they just wanted to have like same, it's not quite the thought control to the level of like China or North Korea or anything like that, but that was kind of like where at least my grandparents generation kind of came through. When they were right in the middle of the war, they were like, just, we're the chosen people, we're children of God, and your God is the emperor. And if the emperor tells you to get on that airplane and die for your country, then that's the best way to live your life. And that people actually believed in that. And that's not even 100 years ago, 60 some years ago, they were doing that. And the people that lived through that can tell me not everybody was really believing in it, especially after the war. The narrative basically kind of took the 180 turn, and everybody basically almost kind of went like way left, thinking, oh, the emperor system was the mistake and all that stuff. But that kind of diversity you don't really get to see on the surface level just living in Japanese society, because not many people kind of openly talk about it. Maybe Twitter is very big in Japan, so like now there's actually a platform for that diverse discussion could take place. But it's the same thing just like in the States, where like the fiery rhetoric just takes over, and like people just started like spreading disinformation and all that stuff. And it really gets ugly when those people that are spewing some fiery rhetorics might actually not know anyone from that era. They just be reading things from internet or like what have you, and they're just like trying to fit whatever the story that they got, whatever is convenient for their own viewpoint. They're trying to fit their narratives or like fit the text that they read to their own viewpoints. And I could tell you that I mean, at least like I have the privilege to actually talk to people that lived through that. And, I'm a little bit older, so I kind of feel certain sense of responsibility, and like I have to tell people about this, so I have to tell this story somehow in a meaningful way that like people actually can take a peek inside what was happening.
It's interesting. It's like there's this idea of being the collective and having one way of thinking, and then individualism where there's platforms like Twitter and whatnot where everyone can say what they think, and it makes you wonder about where the connection between those are, like being community oriented, but also having your own thoughts, and kind of like you said, connecting to others that have had those experiences as opposed to like just confirming their own biases, right?
Yeah, I I might not have the most favorable opinion on my own people, and that's probably why I'm actually living out here. But Japanese, especially when I grew up in 80s, 90s, they really tend to kind of suppress the expression of individualistic views. And I guess I was kind of, and I certainly don't think I was, but like people thought I was eccentric or something. People thought I was like boisterous. People thought I was not abnormal, but definitely not the model Japanese citizen. And that kind of thought is the factor that it's kind of like almost like a mild thought control in a way. Like we live in a democratic society, but it's not the government or the education. Well, education to a certain degree, but like it's not the government or the police state that is, suppressing people's freedom in like thoughts and all that stuff, but it's the community. It's this, like they call it muraishiki, like the village thing. Like, you're part of this community, so you better not vote for the other guy, or you better not be a communist, or one of those. Like, there's the big red was this big enemy for the longest time. And people would say stuff like, "Oh, you don't want to go talk to that lady over at the corner of the whatever because she votes for the Communist Party, and you just don't know what kind of." And I was like, "I don't even know what Communist Party is," and she seems like a nice person. And then turns out that her son was my best friend. So it was like, it's yeah, well, I mean, it's one of those things where as a kid, I never noticed it. But then as you grow older, you're starting to kind of get, oh, that's what they meant. Or that's what that little auntie two doors down was saying, about certain things. People talk a lot, especially in where I'm from. It's a very small community, so everybody knew each other. People are kind of like watching each other in a very subtle way so that no one kind of steps over the boundaries in a way. I don't think it's the case for everybody. I grew up in a very conservative area. It's not like, the cows and rascals running around or anything like that. But, well, we didn't have convenience store until like I was in high school. We only had like three TV stations to tune into. So it wasn't out in the sticks, like out of nowhere, no man's land, but it certainly was not Tokyo. So when you grew up in a big city like Tokyo or Osaka, would have been a totally different story, even in the era that I grew up in.
So you came to LA in 1999. What, I mean, I know you said maybe that kind of what you experienced in terms of certain aspects of Japanese culture made you want to come here in terms of like feeling more like an individual and expressing yourself. Did you come here to play music or?
Yes, I actually went to college in Osaka for 4 years. I met a lot of friends there. One of them had moved to LA, and she had been here for a couple of years, and I came to visit in one of the summer vacations, and I just kind of, I mean, I wouldn't say I fell in love with it, but I really appreciated the weather, appreciated the just an openness. I think it's one of those things that you could feel, right? Oh, it's people are a lot more open, open about things. Open sky, open space, wide open spaces, beautiful beaches, and the living cost was going to be, well, back then it was more affordable than say East Coast, or I was actually even thinking about visiting London. Or I was a kind of a big UK classic rock guy and all that stuff, so I thought about actually maybe hopping over to that side of the pond and all that, just to kind of check out what kind of music scenes that each city had. Osaka had its own thing, which I actually didn't really explore that much. But back then, what my musical taste was just more influenced by English-driven music genre, jazz, prog, funk, R&B, soul, all that stuff. So I had decided to at least spend a year or two. And my study was English. I had a bachelor in English, and I couldn't really speak a word of English. And I felt like I should at least be able to communicate with the language that I have the degree with. So I decided to just basically see what it's like out in LA. I'm still here.
Yeah, here you are. I know you describe yourself as a sound chaser. So is there something that inspires you to be that, or how would you define that for yourself?
I like that term because I'm a songwriter first and foremost because I feel the voice is the one instrument that I will always have, right? My primary instrument is guitar, but like that kind of comes and goes. Actually, since the quarantine, I've been playing more piano and keyboards than guitars. So it's not the instrument or even a song that I get drawn to. It's the sound. I love the sound that things make. I remember I was talking to my wife about it. I remember one of the first beat that I remember is so my dad had a small business growing up. He was a running like a little knitting factory basically. He was kind of creating children's clothes that would be shipped over to Russia and Canada, I think back in those days, 80s. And he would have this like about a dozen big machineries that generates the sheets of knitted material. And that would run almost all night, or at least late enough for me to kind of sleep to. So like one of the earliest sounds that I remember is like me falling asleep to this like dozen huge machineries underneath my bed, just creating this like almost like a train track like sound throughout the entire night. And I would always kind of like tune into that and try to kind of, it's not really, I wasn't really trying, but like kind of finding the pattern in that. And it was like, probably was kind of thinking, like bobbing my head to it without even thinking about it. Like there's certain sounds that kind of captures my curiosity, imagination, what have you, and that still is really just kind of where my a lot of my inspirations come from. A lot of times I just find like a new instrument to kind of mess with, and oh, that's a cool sound. That's a great sound. Even with my own instrument, guitar, there are a million ways of getting different sounds out of it, and that fascinates me the most. I think that's where I don't know where the term comes from. Actually, Soundchaser I think might be one of the songs by Yes, the band, the prog rock band from '70s. I think they had a song called Soundchaser, and I just kind of thought that was appropriate.
I asked Shin more about this sound chasing in relation to his latest EP titled 6 Songs from Insomnia, released in February. I mentioned that the first song, Nobody Somebody, reminded me of sound chasing, while the last song, Hako, had a different sound than the rest of his album that was more jazzy.
You're kind of right about the first and the last song because the last song I wasn't actually planning on including in the EP. I was going to actually make it as a 5-song EP, but that last song is a Japanese song that I wrote 20 years ago, actually, and that I just never did anything with it. I don't remember why, but I decided to record it after everything else was recorded. I had 2 studio sessions for this album, and half of them didn't really make it because I wanted to have some sort of cohesiveness in the batch, right? Because I knew that I wasn't gonna do like a concept album or anything like that, but I just at least wanted to, as I said, like I get really drawn to different types of sound and music styles and genre. So it could sometimes be like kind of all over the map. So I wanted to have certain aesthetical theme throughout the batch. And I basically came down to 5 songs. And then I think that song just kind of was in my head at the time. And I decided to kind of record it really just kind of quickly with the rest of the songs in the EP in my mind. It's just trying to kind of match that sound.
全部閉じ込めたみたいな僕の大事な箱は紫色の月 海の中空を越え飛んできた
And I think that song really came out the most efficient way. I mean, there's very little in that recording. It's just basically guitar, acoustic bass, and the rhythm machine and my voice, and then a few synthesizers to kind of embellish, but that's about it. I just wanted to make it really minimal. And the first song was very much like that too. So in a way, the first and the last song were like two sides of the same thing. One is English and one is Japanese. I think that the first song is the newest song actually that I wrote and the oldest song that I wrote in a way. So it's basically like a two sides of the same soul and ideas presented in a similar way to kind of bookend the batch. So your observation is dead on.
And if you're curious, here's a clip from the most recent song, Nobody Somebody, the one that reminded me of Soundchasing.
Life can be so boring. All of us just conforming. Let's get that coffee going before the day comes to know. It's hard to stay awake. I just need a break.
I was pretty thrilled that my observations were right, especially since I don't consider myself a music aficionado. As Shin mentioned, Hako, the oldest song, is in Japanese. I asked him to talk more about the lyrics.
So I was in a long distance relationship when I first came out here. I had a girl in Osaka, and she would, this is 2000, right? And this is very much a pre iPhone, FaceTime, Skype wasn't even around. So you had to make a phone call, like international calls. And that was a costly business back then. You had to go out to 7-Eleven to buy a calling card. I don't even know if any of the listeners know what that is. It's just a piece of plastic that has the special number. It's like a prepaid card, basically. You call on the number to connect you to the numbers on the different country code. And it'll basically just give you whatever, half hour or whatever for, I don't even remember how much it used to cost, but it just was costly enough for us to decide that, well, let's not talk every day. Maybe we can talk every week. And then, unfortunately, she got into a depression and she basically expressed that she wasn't really ready to talk to me on a regular basis. So we wrote each other, actually wrote letters, handwritten letters. And after, about a year or so, I had like stack of letters from her. And one day she sent me this little box of I don't even remember what it was inside, to be honest with you, at this point. But there's just some trinkets, and it looked nice. It was nice and small. So I kind of kept the box around to basically stash away the letters in it. And that kind of became almost like a kind of physical representation of our relationship that we had. And after we broke up, I think I wrote a song about the box and what was inside and my feelings about it. And that's basically kind of a gist of the lyrics. And it's called Hako, and Hako basically means box.
It's so heartwarming to think of writing letters to each other in this time, even if it was 2000, that still was a time when a lot of things were much more digital. So, even though it was kind of for this reason where, she was feeling a little depressed, it still has a sweetness to it.
Yeah. Because my feeling towards obviously her and the relationship that we had was warm, but there was also kind of like guilt ridden in a way because I was the one that left her basically. I could have just stayed and supported her through. I think she was having a hard time at her new job, and me not being there probably had something to do with it. So it has kind of a bittersweet things to it, and that was definitely one of the first songs that I ever wrote in Japanese, and I felt very exposed when I was I think I just recorded like a quick demo back in those days, and I just kind of didn't do anything with it because it was a little too revealing for me. And I was not brave enough to be that honest with my feelings, be it longing or sense of guilt. I'm pretty sure the guilt had a lot to do with it. I just felt just really guilty about how it had turned out. And then this last year or so, I think I was cleaning out my hard drive and it just like that demo recording popped up, I believe. Oh no, I don't think it was even the demo recording. I think it was just a lyric sheet on a Word doc just as it came up. And I was like, oh shoot, I did write that, didn't I? And I just read it and it's kind of spoke to me. It was like me being 21, 22, kind of speaking to me in a way, Do you remember you used to be like this? And it was like, oh, it's just, I think I laughed and I just cried a little inside, in a way. I was like, oh, I was so innocent and I don't know what the word is.
Yeah, you look back on relationships and you get contemplative and you do kind of laugh. And even though at that time you're heartbroken or there's all these emotions, you can have some space from it, right?
But it also was kind of refreshing to see how direct I was. Because of all these years of being in here, just struggling to stay creative and just, do this music thing or just in life, right? I mean, I really don't have that much to complain. I mean, I'm very fortunate. I count my blessings every day. But also, the life has kind of taken its toll, and I kind of almost forgot how basically kind of complicated my life in a way. And the song is very simple. There's not much to the song, really. It's very, very J-pop, like if you actually kind of break it down, the musical aspect of things and everything. But just the lyrics were just so simple and minimalistic. It was kind of refreshing. I was like, it almost didn't feel like something that I wrote, and yet that's what I wrote. And it was almost like my younger self kind of taught me something about the simplicity in a way.
The funny thing is, it did sound, being the last song on the EP, like the bow on top of a present, and the fact that it's called Box, is I feel that that's very fitting.
That's kind of cute. I didn't even think about that, but
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's great. Yeah, I really, really enjoyed this EP, and I encourage all of you all to go listen and follow Shin on Spotify. It's also on Bandcamp. What other platforms can people find you on?
I actually have stuff on YouTube as well. The album is available on Amazon Music, Google Play, and all that stuff. But yeah, Spotify, Apple Music, all that stuff is a good place to go. Bandcamp is great because you can actually pay for it. And what I'm doing right now is all the money that I get from Bandcamp, I actually match it and donate to ACLU, Downtown Women's Center, and Little Tokyo Service Center. And this actually, I started even before the COVID, but especially now, and not everybody can do it. I totally understand. But if you can spare anything for those organizations that are like fighting, even outside of health workers, the people that are out there actually still fighting for the causes. We were just talking about it at the beginning of the podcast, where like other issues are still around. It's not like it's just going away because of this whole thing. So I'm trying to just do my best to support the people that actually are making difference in a crazy world we live in.
Yeah, well, that's good to know. So that's through Bandcamp, you said, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'll be sure to link to that in the show notes as well as the individual organizations you mentioned so people can check those out.
Also, you just go to my website, which is shinkawasaki.com. Everything is linkable from there. So if you can remember everything, just find me there on the .com.
Yeah, definitely. I will link your website in the show notes as well. Thank you so much. I really learned so much from you about your past and the present and, whatever might happen in the future. We'll see.
We sure, we will see. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Shin. I'm not going to lie. I was a little nervous about this episode because my knowledge about the variety and nuances of music isn't that strong, especially for someone like Shin who experiments with so many different styles and instruments. I worried that I'd ask a completely ridiculous question or get something wrong. But most of this episode explored Shin's migration story, and while his musical dreams definitely influenced his decision to come to the United States, there was so much more to tell. I hope you enjoyed Shin's music at the end. And remember, if you buy his music from Bandcamp, he donates to the causes listed in the show notes, so check those links out. As always, I'd like to thank my creative talent that helped me on this episode. Thank you so much to Tiffany Wong for your help with the MigrAsians cover art, and thank you to Shin Kawasaki for the MigrAsians song, Find Another Way. Music was also provided by CC Mixter, by Airtone with the song Resonance, and of course, Shin Kawasaki provided his songs Nobody's Somebody and Hako. Last and definitely not least, thank you to Quincy Surasmith for editing this episode. And of course, I want to give a shout out to my $20 a month and above Patreon patrons. So thank you to my brother, Charlene, Gina Manola, and Jalia Guérin for your generous support. Thank you to all of my Patreon patrons. Remember, you could support this podcast by going to www.patreon.com/migrasians. This is Nisha Modi. Thank you again, and until next time.